Thanks for tuning in to the Football Talk Squadron. I'm Dutch, and this is our next episode going over college football. Committee's rankings just came out yesterday night, so we'll go through those, sort of the changes that happened. Nothing really happened through the top 5, but later on we'll talk about just sort of things that didn't make sense. We'll rehash some of the committee biases that we had last week going into this week, and we'll talk about it going forward. But for our tradition of past and present, we'll start with the past first. So this guy graduated from the University of Texas, played for the Titans, Eagles, Bills, Packers, Browns. So University of Texas, Titans, Eagles, Bills, Packers, Browns. The big hint is where he fell in the draft. 2006, he was first round pick, number 3 overall. If I gave any more of a hint for the University of Texas, probably be a dead giveaway, which is also probably the other big giveaway, me saying that. If you need a little bit more time, go ahead and pause, because the answer is Vince Young. I wanted to pull him out. You know, when you think about all-time quarterbacks in the collegiate level, he's definitely going to be up there. We're definitely, right now in college, we're seeing quarterbacks really driving the league, especially with some other teams, not so much the top teams. Will sort of get into that and sort of quarterback play and who's playing well, who's playing not. What's the big change up throughout the current, throughout the weeks in the season so far. But with Young, he's always going to be remembered for beating USC, the team that everyone thought was unbeatable. I know me and Ma have talked about it. I think we've even talked about it on camera. USC, it was not about if USC was going to win that game. It was going to be how many points was USC going to win by. And Texas found a way. Plain and simple, they rose to the occasion and beat USC when it needed, and Vince Young went out a champion. Went to the NFL, had a rough time, bounced around a bunch of different teams, as we just read, never materialized into that first, overall pick that the Titans thought they were getting. He had some good moments with the Titans, but just nothing that latched him on to being, a franchise quarterback in that organization. But that rounds out the past. For the present, I wanted to go with a guy that in the NFL is I wouldn't say he's not the number one guy on his team. I'll put it that way. Still think he's a star. Still think he's really good. But I think he's got a harder school that maybe people don't know where he went to. So that he's a wide receiver for the Buffalo Bills. He's the number 2 guy, Gabe Davis. Where did he go to school? So what I will tell you is it is now a Power 5 school. It used to not be. They did have an undefeated season a few years ago, but those are sort of the 2 big hints. I will tell you that the other big hint is he played on a national championship team. Now, there's a backup story to that, but I wanted to say that real quick. If you need a little bit more time, go ahead and pause, because the answer is the University of Central Florida. Now, you're going to sit back and go, well, they're not a national championship school. And that's why I say it's a little bit of a hint, but it's not the actual truth of it. Yes, UCF claims national champion because they went undefeated that year, because they beat Auburn, who in turn beat Alabama, who was the national champion that year. UCF claimed that they're a national champion. They even put it on the stadium. I mean, UCF fans truly believe that they're a national championship school. However, I mean, in terms of did they actually play in the CFP or play for the national championship? No. We can get into the long story of how they claim it at a later episode of sort of how we've got to the point of really the college football playoff. You have to understand that before the BCS championship series came around, it was dictated by polls. And that's why in multiple years you'll see, especially in the 60s, 50s, 70s, that 2 teams finished with a national championship claim. Even in the 90s, Michigan, when Tom Brady was a freshman, claimed a national championship, I believe, in 1997. I can look that up real quick as we're sitting here talking. But in terms of they also had to share that national championship with another school, which was Nebraska. They finished second in the coaches poll, resulting in a split national championship. That led, all these different ties in the polls led to them going to the BCS. The frustration with the BCS led to the 4-team playoff with the CFP. The frustration with the 4-team CFP next year is leading to the 12-team CFP playoff race. And we'll see where it goes from there if that doesn't fix it. UCF used one of those polls that in the past was used to validate and say, yes, this team was the national champion. It listed them as number one. They claimed it. But I don't think a lot of people knew where Gabe Davis was. It's a long story for short, but we're getting there. So, as I just sort of explained how the rankings have happened, you take a look at the rankings this week, and these are the big things I'll touch on. We really argued in depth last week about Ohio State being overrated, why they were overrated in terms of how the committee is supposed to look at the variables that they are supposed to use in order to rank these teams 1 through 25. So you got strength of schedule, strength of play, common opponents, quality of wins and such. That is supposed to dictate how they fall. We sort of talked about how Ohio State got the benefit of the strength of schedule, but not the quality of play. But then you look at Georgia and Michigan. They both were really looked at not as schedule because they're playing pretty much the same strength of schedule. They were more looked at as quality of play, of which Michigan's played better than Georgia against inferior opponents, while Georgia gave up 20 points to Vanderbilt. Michigan's not letting teams score that much, but yet Georgia's ahead of Michigan. Then you got Florida State, who was given, hey, they have really good quality wins. They've looked dominant. And then you just have Washington sitting on the outside that's played a lot of good teams. Yes, they've had struggles against some teams. However, they've undefeated. They have the best win, still according to the committee, against Oregon, who won yet again. But you just sort of sit back and you look. Now, for this rankings, where was the biggest change? It was Oklahoma getting beat by Kansas. So that pushed Oklahoma from 9th all the way to 17th. Kept Texas at 7th, Alabama at 8th. Ole Miss filled their spot at number 9, and then Penn State. Now, some things I want to talk about this episode, and we'll get into it. We're going to go over the one-loss teams and sort of the differences in between those teams and where they lie, and just some things to think about and why they may not be ranked completely appropriate. We'll get into some different arguments. Then you have 4 3-loss teams, and those teams especially, now that they're in the poll, there's a lot more questions that need to be asked, and that's due to, in part, some of them were unranked last week, who they bumped out, why they're back in, just taking a look at the overall team. So in order to do that, what I'll start with is I'll start with the 3-loss teams. And I start with this because the biggest argument I think anyone's going to have against the polls is the teams that are put in really after that number 10 position. And you could make the argument for Louisville at number 11 that they still have a chance to get into the CFP if they beat Florida State, don't lose another game. There's an outside probability they could sneak their way in. However, that's very difficult. Outside of that number 11 spot, none of these teams are going to make it in. Why? Because they all have 2 losses. And it's not that it's impossible. It's just that it's never happened before that you've had a 2-loss team going in. So we're just not going to really talk about them in terms of them running the race to get into the playoffs, but more about how the committee is using these teams with 2 to 3 losses to really justify the rankings of other teams. And that's where you really get into a flawed argument. So 3-loss teams, you've got LSU, Notre Dame, Arizona, and Kansas State. Now you sit back and you go, LSU, they just got beat pretty handily by Bama. They kept up with them first half, took the lead, opening drive second half, and then Bama sealed the door and never turned back. LSU, who have they lost to? They've lost to Florida State, Ole Miss, and Bama. Now, when you sit back and you look at who they lost to, all of those teams are in the top 10. So Florida State number 4, Bama number 8, Ole Miss number 9, you would sit back and go, they've played a really hard schedule. They've lost some games. Yes, they have 3 losses, but they've lost to really good football teams, according to the committee. Their win was against Mizzou, who the committee last week had ranked at number 12. They're down to number 14, but they have a top 15 win. Then you go to Notre Dame. And then this is sort of where you start this is where the head scratches start coming in terms of where these teams are. Notre Dame has lost to Ohio State, Louisville, and Clemson. Their wins that are no longer top 25 teams, but were top 25 when they played them according to the AP poll, was USC and Duke. Now, USC got bumped out of the polls this week. Duke has been bumped out of the polls for a few weeks, but Notre Dame doesn't have a top 25 win right now. And Notre Dame just lost to Clemson, which a lot of people, I think, would call that a major upset. I had them picked to upset Notre Dame. However, I just didn't have faith in Notre Dame. And it was more about them going into Clemson and playing is still a tough environment. Like, I don't care how bad Clemson is. Anytime you go into a home team stadium, they're going to have some fight. And Notre Dame has always struggled with Clemson. I get last year, Notre Dame, obliterated them at home, really sent and destroyed sort of what Clemson had going. You had Cole Klubnik, who comes in, throws a pick six. DJ Uyunglele, he goes to Oregon State. All these things happens after that game really sort of set it into catalyst. But from the standpoint of who is Notre Dame's, I would argue, is not really a great football team. Like, they haven't proven that they've beat really good teams. The committee may say, well, they beat Pittsburgh, and that's the team that beat Louisville, and Louisville is who beat you. It's one of those ones where it's like this circle of, mediocrity. We just keep revolving these teams in order to justify a team schedule. Because if Notre Dame was to have gotten bumped out this week and out of the top 25, the only team that Ohio State would have beaten in the top 25 as of yet would be Penn State. That's it. Now, you sit back and look at Penn State and you look at who they've played, the answer is no one. They played Michigan this week at home. Michigan's a 5-point favorite. It sucks for Penn State. It's not a night whiteout. It's a noon o'clock kickoff. I don't know how in the world that happens when you have a marquee matchup like that, but it does. With the scheduling committee, you sit back and look at that game. It's not going to be I'm sure it's still going to be loud, but it is a different environment when you have to play a team at night. If Penn State gets drubbed by Michigan and Michigan blows them out of the water, and let's just say that Michigan sort of does, unthinkable, beats them like 40-0, blanks Penn State or holds them to less than 7. Now you have a common opponent between them and Ohio State. How do you grade them going forward? You have a common opponent that one team beat more heavily than the other on the road compared to Ohio State at home. How do you handle that difference? That will be very interesting to see based upon how it works out this week. I think Michigan goes in there and absolutely murders Penn State. That's just my feeling of what's going to happen. I really like Michigan's defense. I get that they have a lot of negative aspects around the program with the sign stealing investigation going on. That can be debated, on ESPN and everything about what they should do. At the end of the day, you're innocent until proven guilty in this country. And I'm not saying that in support of Michigan. I'm saying that as more as like, we don't know what happened. Like, until it's going to take not just weeks, it's probably going to take months after the college football season is even over for them to announce any of that. Until there is actual, criminal prosecution that happens or actual evidence that comes out and says, here's the actual facts, here's what happened, and they actually start punishment, Michigan's still on the table. And as long as they keep winning, which I think they do, they're going to be a part of the conversation. But you look at Notre Dame and you say, why are they there? In my opinion, it's to help bolster Ohio State's record, because outside of those two teams, they really haven't played anybody, and they've struggled with the teams that they've played. Like, at the end of the day, yes, they have it pulled away in the second half, but at no point would you say they've dominated Rutgers, they've dominated Wisconsin. I mean, you just look back at last year when they played these teams with C.J. Stroud, like, they were blowing these teams out of the water, and they are just failing to, especially in the first half of football, really show that they are a number one team in the nation. I think that's where a lot of the argument comes down to. The third loss team is Arizona. So Arizona has 3 losses. Who are they to? Well, 2 of them, you would say, not bad losses. Washington and Southern Cal. Both of those schools, really sort of the powerhouses in the Pac-12. Their other loss, though, is pretty bad. Mississippi State. Mississippi State's a terrible football team. I don't mean that as just like a terrible for SEC. They are terrible in like the entire college football. I mean, you look at some of the games that they played and how they've played. They are a really, really bad football team, and Arizona lost to them. I get that probably the reason the committee has put them into the polls is the last 3 weeks they have beat top 25 ranked teams at the time. UCLA, Oregon State, Washington State. Now, only one of those teams is still ranked in the top 25, which is Oregon State. However, you sit back and look at the other 2, they're not even viewed as top 25 teams right now. For me, this is where you sort of get into this mess that Arizona does have a worse loss to Mississippi State, but they have better wins than Notre Dame. So how are they being justified as going in, one spot behind Notre Dame when Notre Dame really hasn't beaten anyone a true test? Oregon State's ranked the number 12 team in the country. Arizona beat them. Notre Dame's best win, they're not on the top 25 list right now. So it's one of those ones that you sit back and you go, well, they're a 3-loss team. The other reason I bring up Arizona, one of the schools they beat, USC, who was eliminated from the polls this week by the CFP committee. You look at USC, who have they lost to? Notre Dame, Utah, Washington. All 3 of those teams are what? Ranked by the CFP committee right now in the top 25. All of those teams are in the top 20. USC beat Arizona. So USC has the tiebreaker against Arizona. Both have 3 losses. USC did not lose to a Mississippi State school. USC lost to 3 top 20 teams in the nation. But USC's not ranked. But Arizona's in the polls. I say this to say, you take that exact information and you look at how they treat Texas versus Alabama, and you look at their strength of schedule, and you look at who they've played and their top victories, and Alabama has better wins. Now, who's their head-to-head loss to? Texas. So it makes sense. Texas is ahead of Alabama, even though they each have 1 loss. The one was to the other, so that team's in front. And until Texas loses again, it's probably going to stay that way unless Bama wins the SEC championship. I get there was a lot of, Kirk Herbstreit came out and said that if both schools won out, Texas is in and Bama's out. I could not disagree more with that. And that is because Texas will not play anyone for the rest of the year, including the Big 12 championship. I get that Oklahoma State is ranked right now number 15. When you look at who Oklahoma State lost to, it was to South Alabama. And not just like, hey, they barely lost to South Alabama. They got 37-7 blown out by South Alabama. South Alabama took them to the woodshed and back. And they lost to Iowa State, who is yet again at the bottom of the Big 12. They've played better here as of late, but it's not a school that you're going to sit back and ever compare them to Georgia. If Alabama goes undefeated through the rest of the season and meets Georgia in the SEC championship, there's no doubt in my mind they're going to jump Texas. Plain and simple. You look at who that team, and it's sort of I get that is, a pretty Bama bias, but I just sit back and look at it and go, you have to think about where these teams were and where they'll be here in a few weeks if both schools win out. There's a lot that could happen above them that would make it that both schools could still get in. Michigan's going to have to play Ohio State. Washington is probably going to have to play Oregon again. Florida State really has the clearest path right now in terms of there's no one left out there to really challenge them outside of Louisville in the ACC championship game. That's it. For those schools, there's going to be multiple teams with 1 loss. How does that all shake out in the end? I don't know, but it's more of a conjecture of what the committee is doing right now. Is I think what we'll see if it all happens where you have a lot of drama there at the end of the season. But them leaving USC out of the poll to me is dumb. And I'll put it this way: Iowa's sitting there at number 22. is a complete head scratcher. They lost to Minnesota and they lost to Penn State. Their best victory outside of that is maybe Wisconsin. And when I say maybe, I mean just look at their schedule. Like, I couldn't tell you who in the world you would sit back and try to justify their ranking with. Now, I sit back and go, well, why does Iowa's schedule matter? I think it's because it's helped to justify Penn State's ranking, because outside of Iowa, Penn State hasn't beat a ranked opponent. That's it. Like, Penn State really hasn't played anyone. And you could argue the exact same for Iowa. Iowa has not played a lot of teams. They've beat Penn State, they lost to Penn State, beat Michigan State, beat Purdue, lost to Minnesota, beat Wisconsin, beat Northwestern. And then when you look at that Northwestern, the fact that they jumped into the top 25 poll as a top 25 team in the nation after playing Northwestern in the first half was like punt, fumble, turnover on downs for both teams. It was a horrendous game to watch. I can't imagine that game looked like it was played in the days when Wrigley Field was brand new. That's how terrible a football game that was. I mean, it was like before passing was invented is what you got out of that game. With Iowa being pushed up, and you look at that, if you put Iowa on the same field as USC is going to win that game. I get that USC is probably going to give up a few more points, but USC's offense will beat Iowa's defense. The fact that they're putting Iowa into the top 25, it's a complete head scratcher. You just sit back and you don't know how they're doing that. And I'd argue the same with UNC. You look at UNC, they have lost to one really bad football team in Virginia and the other to Georgia Tech, who I would argue is still towards the bottom of play in the ACC. They've lost to two really bad schools in the ACC. Their only good win is against Miami. Miami's not ranked, but yet they jumped in. And then the real head scratcher for me is the last third loss team, which is Kansas State. So Kansas State has lost to Mizzou, lost to Oklahoma State, both of which are ranked. However, their last loss came to Texas, which was this week. So yet again, you have a team that loses to a team with a backup quarterback in, and they jump into the top 25. That does not make any sense to me in the least, except that it helps build Texas's strength of schedule. Is the CFP committee can say, hey, they beat Oklahoma, they beat Kansas State, they beat Kansas, 3 top 25 teams. Because if they don't put them in there, and I would argue Kansas sitting at 16th. I mean, you look at Kansas and you go, they lost to Texas, they lost to Oklahoma State. Their only big win is Oklahoma. And Oklahoma doesn't look good now. Like, Oklahoma has lost 2 straight. Oklahoma doesn't play anybody for the rest of the year outside of Big 12. But Kansas State has not played anyone outside the Big 12 either. Like, you're justifying them by being better than Kansas has been in the past. I get it's the first time since 1997 that they beat Oklahoma. That's not so much because Kansas is really good. It's because Oklahoma played really bad. Oklahoma wasn't the team that we thought they were. Plain and simple. And it showed up the next week against Oklahoma State. Those teams being put into the top 25, like if you put Kansas on the field with USC, who's my money going on? USC. That's where my money's going on. If you put my money on Kansas having to go play LSU, I'm telling you, as a Bama fan watching them play against LSU has an amazing offense. LSU would beat Kansas. Would Kansas beat the team right behind them, 2 spots behind in Utah? I don't think so. I think Utah's defense is really good. Like, Utah would beat Kansas. Why is it then that Kansas is sitting at 16th? It's a justified Texas being at 7. Plain and simple. Like, I don't know how you get Kansas being the 16th ranked best team in the country when they haven't played anybody. But it's used to help, who's the one team right behind them? Oklahoma. And that's sort of, I get back to that Arizona, you have Texas in front of Bama, Kansas in front of Oklahoma, because those are the schools that they beat. They're 1 spot ahead. But then you have Arizona in the poll and you kick out USC. That does not make sense in my mind. So those are the 3 lost teams. The 1 lost teams, we'll get to those. So you got Oregon at 6, Texas at 7th, Bama at 8th, Ole Miss at 9th, Penn State 10th, and Louisville 11th. Where is this going to go going forward? Oregon has a really favorable matchup this week against USC. And the reason I say that is it is a common opponent. USC just comes off the loss to Washington. It was close. USC battled that whole game. If Oregon can go in and beat USC like they beat Utah, then you sit back and you go, hey, it's a common opponent that both of these teams had. One blew out the other. It would be interesting to see how the committee uses that, even though they have a one loss to Washington, just based upon how Washington's played since that game, if they would have the cojones to bump Oregon up. I think it's going to help Oregon stay exactly where they are, and no one's going to jump them for the time being. But it's one of those arguments that you sit back and you go, having a common opponent in USC will help Oregon's argument against Washington, even though Washington was the team that beat them. You look at Texas. Texas is playing TCU. They really don't play anyone until the Big 12 championship. Who they play, don't know. Most likely, I would argue it's going to be Oklahoma State based upon how many times Oklahoma State would have to lose going forward for Oklahoma to get in, or Kansas. But that's just sort of where we're at right now. Then you've got Bama sitting there. Bama is starting to look like the Bama teams of old in terms of how they beat LSU. A very good offense. It was the offensive type of game that I think sent a message to the rest of the college football world that Jalen Milroe's figuring out. And his legs were a big-time threat. They weren't using him early in the season with his legs. Maybe that was, hey, we're just trying to save him towards the end of the year, make a playoff run. Whatever that may be, that is a team that no one wants to play right now. They're looking very, very good on the defensive side of the ball. I saw a stat that against, I think it was Ole Miss, LSU, Tennessee, and I forget who the third team was. They were 80, or fourth team was, in the second half, they're 82 points to 13 given up. Like, they've only given up 13 points against these teams in the second half of football games, but scored 82. Bama is playing very well in the second half. It's a big Nick Saban trait, second half adjustments. It'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. Those three teams right there, they control their own destiny. And that is the outside of Louisville. Louisville's the other school that can control its own destiny. If they have a path right now, if they win out, they will play in the ACC championship against Florida State. For Louisville, you sit back and you look at Ole Miss and Penn State, they do not control their own fate, which is a very interesting theory for sort of both, but I think more so for Ole Miss. Ole Miss, if they win out, big win this, if they get a win this coming week against Georgia, that will completely shake up the college football world. If Ole Miss wins out, they will still not play for the SEC championship because they have one loss to Bama. As long as Bama beats Kentucky next week and then Auburn, they're in to the SEC. They only have to beat one of those opponents to knock out Ole Miss of the SEC championship from the West, because Bama would have to lose to both Kentucky and Auburn for Ole Miss to advance to the SEC championship if Ole Miss wins. But let's just play a game that Bama wins out, wins the SEC championship. Ole Miss wins out, they beat Georgia, and Georgia's only two losses are to Bama and Ole Miss. That would be the ultimate test for the committee to see what they do with Ole Miss, because you would have a scenario that Ole Miss has beaten Georgia, they've beaten LSU, they have beat a lot of the SEC powerhouses, and their only fault is they couldn't beat Bama and they weren't in the SEC title game. How do you then compare that? Because the other conferences and the SEC's going to this next year, they've already announced that they're going to play just like the Pac-12 does. That the two teams that finish top of the division in terms of wins and losses in conference play will play for the championship game. Right now, both the Big Ten and the SEC still play by divisional based of who wins that division. Both of those conferences are going to how the Pac-12 plays this year in terms of the highest two teams will play one another. It will make it better as the season goes on, and I really like that idea. It eliminates possibly this happening where you have a one-loss team left out, because if Ole Miss was to win out, Bama wins out, Ole Miss would get their second shot at Bama in the SEC championship game, as it should be. It would entice a lot of things going forward. It would make it more interesting. We'll just have to wait for it next year. Penn State's in the same boat. If they beat Michigan, they still need Ohio State to lose twice in order to make it to the Big 12 championship game. The difference between those two schools is that Ole Miss has better wins in terms of how the committee ranks right now. Penn State, their only wins against Iowa. Ole Miss has beaten multiple top 25 teams. They're just not going to get the opportunity. How does the committee rank it if Penn State was to somehow pull a shocker against Michigan this week? I don't see that coming, but that being said, Louisville's that last team that you really sit back and think about, and you go, well, how is this going to work out for the committee going forward? They have a really good win against Notre Dame, who, clearly the committee likes because it's a big piece of Ohio State's resume. If Louisville was to win out and then beat Florida State, how do you look at that one-loss team? Because it's going to be a comparable measurement of if Washington loses to Oregon, you have a one-loss Texas team. Let's say Bama wins out. You get a one-loss Oregon, one-loss Texas, one-loss Alabama, one-loss Louisville. Who you putting in? That would be a complete game changer, assuming that the champion out of the Big Ten is undefeated. You have 3 one-loss conference champions. How do you rack and stack those teams? That would be super interesting. It would cause enough drama that people's heads would explode. They'd probably demand the 12-team playoff this year, but that's sort of where you're going. The last school's Tulane that has one loss. I mean, they really haven't played anyone. They're not a Power 5 opponent. It's clear that their schedule is being used against them. I mean, they're behind multiple 3-loss teams. Tulane's 1 loss. It's clear that their strength of schedule and who they've played and how they've won is affecting them in the polls, which is very interesting when you think about how the rest of the teams are laid out. And that goes for the undefeateds, that goes for the 1-loss teams, that goes for the 2-loss teams and 3-loss. Is that there is, and that's sort of the, I guess, if I wanted to put a real bow on how the CFP committee rankings have gone the first 2 weeks, it's that there is no consistency in the CFP rankings. At no point can you look at the undefeated, the 1-loss, 2-loss, and 3-loss teams and say, hey, all of these rankings make sense based upon the variables that you told us you were going to use to justify these rankings going forward. That's the biggest issue with the CFP committee, is you clearly see there's bias. You clearly see that, hey, based upon these teams, their brand name, who they are, maybe what they've done in the past, there's a lot of arguments that can be made that those are more affecting the committee and how they're ranking teams than actually what's happening on the football field. What we'll see going forward is complete chaos. You have multiple of these teams playing one another in the top 25. How it all shakes out in the end, we're going to be here for. It'll be awesome. I can't sit back and tell you anything other than that. Then I can't wait to see what happens in the following weeks. It will really shape the college football world and really talk about the CFP committee. I say also this to say, I think that this year, I want you to always think about it in terms of how they're judging teams now compared to how they're going to judge them in a 12-team playoff. Me and Maul are going to do an episode on the 12-team playoff. We're going to wait until the CFP committee ranking gives their final top 25 ranking before actually the playoff and all the bowl games happen. The reason that we're going to do that is, and I'm sure it's going to blow up of what the 12-team playoff would have looked like this year, is how do you think the committee would have changed things based upon their rankings right now for the top 4 compared to next year? Because I guarantee you, no matter what happens going forward, that at the end of this season, when the committee gives their final rankings, there'll be plenty of arguments made that if this was a 12-team playoff, the rankings would have been different. When that should not matter, but it's going to matter going forward. I just want to point that out in order to highlight the fact that you're going to see inconsistencies with the CFP committee. Until these guys have to each individually produce their own ballot and show how they voted for these teams and how they got to this point, and they just don't have some dude standing there in a suit trying to tell you something that you don't have guys actually really pushing him on ESPN to answer and be like, hey, no, you're avoiding this. How are you justifying this for this? You're not getting those questions asked. Probably never will, because, as Maul's always said, ESPN's got their hand in the pocket. They're really controlling where the teams are going. Hopefully there's chaos, leads to more stronger arguments. We'll see as the season goes forward. I do want to thank you guys for tuning in today. Please go to our Instagram and TikTok, follow us and subscribe. If you have any comments, questions, anything we can do different, change, please let us know. We're always trying to make things better here. Go to our website, footballtalksquadron.com. At the bottom, you'll see, a comment section that you can contact us, reach out. Love to hear from you guys. Thanks for tuning in. We'll talk about everything that happens next week with both NFL and college. But until then, time to pull chalks. I'll see you next week.